The strongest people are often the ones who never ask for help until their silence finally breaks them. I used to believe that hard work could solve almost anything. Show up early, stay late, never complain, never become someone else's problem. That was the rule I lived by from the day I first walked through the glass doors of Ashford Dynamics. Every morning I arrived before sunrise, when the city outside still glowed under sleepy amber streetlights and the elevators echoed through an almost empty building. The cleaning crew knew my name. The security guards nodded before I even reached the front desk. My coffee was always black, usually cold before I remembered to drink it, and my desk was already buried under schedules, contracts, and meeting notes before most people had even left their apartments. My name is Maya Sinclair, and for nearly 3 years I served as executive assistant to Julian Ashford. Everyone called him a billionaire. Some called him untouchable. Others simply lowered their voices whenever his name entered a conversation. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. One calm sentence from Julian could redirect an entire company. One quiet glance could silence a boardroom full of executives twice his age. Working beside him meant precision. Mistakes weren't dramatic, they simply weren't supposed to happen. Somehow, I learned to keep up. I memorized every appointment without checking my calendar. I anticipated every phone call before it came through. I could tell whether he wanted coffee or silence just by the way he set his briefcase down. People used to joke that I knew Julian's schedule better than he did. They weren't wrong. What they didn't know was how much of myself had disappeared behind that efficiency. My mother needed dialysis 3 times a week. My younger brother was halfway through engineering school, chasing a future neither of us could afford to lose. Every medical bill, every tuition payment, every unexpected expense landed quietly on my shoulders. So I picked up freelance work after midnight. I skipped meals without thinking about it. I convinced myself that 4 hours of sleep counted as enough if I had another cup of coffee before sunrise. Whenever someone asked if I was okay, I smiled automatically. I'm fine, those 2 words became easier than the truth. Easier than admitting my hands sometimes trembled while typing. Easier than admitting the office lights occasionally blurred into soft halos that refused to focus. Easier than explaining why one flight of stairs suddenly left me breathless. Nobody noticed. Or maybe everyone was simply too busy. Julian certainly never asked, not because he was cruel. If anything, he treated every employee with quiet professionalism. But he expected excellence, and I gave him exactly that every single day. At least, I thought I did. That Tuesday began like every other. Rain tapped softly against the skyscraper windows while the city vanished beneath low gray clouds. My inbox filled faster than I could answer it. 3 board members changed their flights. 2 investors requested private meetings. A billion-dollar acquisition presentation needed revisions before noon. I moved from task to task without stopping, ignoring the faint ringing in my ears that had followed me since dawn. I reached for another folder, and for the first time in years, my fingers missed the edge of the desk. The file slipped to the floor. I stared at it longer than I should have, suddenly unable to remember why I'd picked it up in the first place. Then I heard Julian's office door open behind me, and before I could straighten my shoulders and pretend everything was normal, the room tilted just enough for me to realize something inside me had finally begun to break. I bent to retrieve the folder, but the paper blurred before my eyes. The neat black letters dissolved into meaningless shapes, swimming together as if someone had poured water across the page. I blinked once, then twice. It didn't help. My fingertips felt strangely cold while the rest of my body burned beneath my blazer. I heard Julian's footsteps cross the marble floor with the same steady rhythm they always carried, calm, controlled, unhurried. Usually I recognized that sound and already had the next document waiting before he reached my desk. Today I couldn't even remember which meeting came next. Maya. His voice was low, almost questioning. I forced myself upright so quickly the room tilted again. Everything's ready, I answered automatically, though I was no longer certain it was true. He studied me a second longer than usual. Boardroom in 5 minutes. Yes, sir. He gave a small nod and continued down the hallway. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, gathered the scattered papers, straightened my jacket, and followed him toward the executive conference room. 22 people were already seated around the polished walnut table by the time I connected my laptop to the presentation screen. Outside, rain streaked the glass, turning the skyline into a watercolor of gray towers and blurred light. Inside, every chair was filled with investors, attorneys, and senior executives waiting for Julian to begin discussing the acquisition that had consumed all of our lives for months. I stood near the screen with my tablet, ready to advance each slide the instant he needed it. That was always my role. Invisible. Reliable. Perfect. Julian spoke with the same composed confidence that had built his reputation. He never raised his voice. He never rushed. Every sentence landed with quiet certainty, and every person in the room listened. I followed along effortlessly at first, changing charts and financial forecasts without missing a beat. Then the numbers stopped making sense. One graph became two. The words on my tablet drifted apart. A sharp ringing filled my ears, drowning out the room. I tried to use Julian's voice as an anchor, but it sounded farther away with every passing second. My heartbeat grew strangely loud. Too loud. I reached for the water bottle beside the podium, but my hand shook so badly it slipped from my fingers and rolled across the table. Several heads turned toward me. Heat rushed into my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered, bending to retrieve it. The simple movement stole what little balance I had left. The room seemed to stretch endlessly around me. The ceiling lights grew too bright to look at. I remember Julian stopping mid-sentence. I remember his eyes locking onto mine, no longer focused on a billion-dollar negotiation, but on something he had apparently never noticed before. I tried to tell him I was fine. I even managed half a smile, because that was what I always did. Then my knees refused to hold me. The tablet slipped from my hands and struck the carpet with a dull, echoing thud. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed everything was Julian moving faster than I'd ever seen him move, reaching me before anyone else even pushed back their chair. I woke to the steady rhythm of a heart monitor and the faint scent of antiseptic. For one confused moment I thought I'd overslept and missed work. Panic hit before memory did, the boardroom, the faces, Julian's expression right before the lights went out. I tried to sit up. A gentle voice stopped me. "Please, don't rush. You've been unconscious for several hours." A nurse adjusted the blanket over my legs and checked the monitor. Afternoon light filtered through the window, turning the white room almost gold. "Your blood pressure dropped dangerously low," she said. "You're severely exhausted, dehydrated, and your iron levels are critically low. Your file shows you were advised months ago to continue treatment." I closed my eyes. Months ago. I remembered the prescription still sitting in my kitchen drawer, because every refill cost money that was already spoken for. "Your employer brought you here," the nurse continued with a small smile. "He made sure every specialist was available before he left." My chest tightened. Julian had meetings, investors, a company depending on him. A hospital was the last place I'd imagined him spending a morning. Before I could ask anything else, the door opened. My physician stepped in, tablet in hand, expression kind but concerned. "Maya, your body's been warning you for a long time." He pulled up a chair. "Your records show you cancelled your last 4 appointments." I stared at my hands. "I was busy." He sighed. "Busy doesn't explain why you stopped treatment altogether." I didn't answer, because the truth sounded ridiculous out loud. Dialysis bills came first. My brother's tuition came second. Rent came third. Somewhere below all of it came me. He looked down at the financial notes attached to my chart. "Your insurance only covered part of the recommended care. Did cost become the reason?" I gave the smallest nod. He didn't judge me. Somehow that made it worse. After he left, silence settled over the room. I reached for my phone. 19 missed calls, most from coworkers. 3 from my brother, Noah. 1 text from my mother, *, are you working too hard again, sweetheart? Please remember to eat, *, I smiled sadly. She still believed I always listened. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I expected another nurse. Instead, a woman from HR stepped in, carrying my purse and a neatly folded blazer. Maya, she said gently, setting everything on the chair. Mr. Ashford asked me to bring your things. I blinked. He remembered. She looked almost surprised by the question. He personally made sure nothing was left behind in your office. My heartbeat quickened for reasons I couldn't explain. Before leaving, she hesitated. One more thing, he cleared the rest of his schedule today. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Julian Ashford did not cancel important meetings. Entire industries adjusted around his calendar, not the other way around. Yet somehow, after watching his assistant collapse, he'd walked away from everything else. I looked toward the rain-speckled window, unable to shake the feeling that when I went back, nothing between us would be quite the same. The first morning without Maya Sinclair felt wrong. Julian noticed it before he even stepped out of the elevator. Her desk was empty. No fresh coffee beside the morning reports. No neatly stacked folders in perfect order. The entire executive floor felt like it had lost its rhythm. He walked into his office without a word. Instead of opening the acquisition documents, he looked through the glass wall toward the vacant desk outside. 3 years. That was how long she'd worked for him, and somehow he realized he knew almost nothing about her. He knew exactly how she organized contracts. He knew she preferred blue ink over black. He knew she answered every email within 10 minutes and remembered every executive's birthday without checking a calendar. Yet he didn't know where she lived. He didn't know she'd been ill. He didn't know she'd been carrying a weight heavy enough to make her collapse in front of an entire boardroom. That realization stayed with him longer than he expected. Marcus, he said quietly when his head of security stepped in. I want a complete internal review. Marcus frowned. Of the acquisition? Julian shook his head slowly. Of Maya Sinclair. Within hours, information began piling onto his desk: security footage, internal communications, payroll records, expense approvals. Julian watched weeks of camera recordings from the executive floor, something he had never once done before. There she was, every morning, arriving before almost anyone else with a paper cup of coffee and a tired smile. There she was every evening, still working long after entire departments had gone home. One recording caught his attention, Maya quietly collecting abandoned folders from a conference room after midnight, while another executive walked past without acknowledging her. Another showed her carrying heavy archive boxes herself after maintenance had already left. She never asked anyone for help. She simply kept moving. Julian requested the access logs next. The number surprised even him. Maya had entered the building before 6 a.m. on 31 separate mornings over the previous 2 months. On 15 occasions, she hadn't left until after 10 at night. He leaned back in silence. Those hours alone would have exhausted anyone. Then Marcus placed another folder on the desk. You should see this. Inside were reimbursement requests Maya had quietly withdrawn before approval, hotel costs for unexpected trips, transportation after late meetings, months of documentation she'd never submitted. Tens of thousands of dollars she could have legally claimed but chose not to. Julian turned another page. A string of emails between Maya and department managers followed the same pattern, again and again. Someone missed a deadline, and Maya took the blame instead. Someone forgot to prepare documents, and Maya stayed overnight to finish them. Someone made a costly scheduling error, and Maya apologized to the client before anyone else even knew there'd been a problem. Not once did she name another employee. She protected everyone except herself. Julian closed the folder slowly. Who approved this workload? Marcus hesitated. Technically, no one. She volunteered every time. Julian stood and walked toward the empty desk again. For the first time, he noticed the small family photograph tucked behind her monitor, a smiling older woman, a young man in a graduation gown, and Maya standing between them, smiling exactly the way she smiled every morning at work. Warm. Gentle. Completely hiding how exhausted she really was. He rested one hand on the back of her chair. His voice was barely above a whisper. You carried everyone else. He looked at his own reflection in the dark office window. Now it's my turn to carry you. 2 days later, the doctors finally agreed to let me go home, but only after repeating the same instructions so many times I could have recited them myself. More rest. Regular meals. Medication without skipping a single dose. Follow-up appointments that, for the first time in months, I actually promised to keep. My apartment felt strangely quiet when I unlocked the door. The familiar smell of coffee and old books greeted me like an old friend. Bills still waited on the kitchen counter, exactly where I'd left them. My mother's treatment schedule was still stuck to the fridge with a faded magnet. Noah's college acceptance letter hung beside it, edges starting to curl. Life hadn't paused while I was in the hospital. It had simply continued without asking whether I was ready. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. I expected another reminder from the clinic. Instead it was the billing office at the dialysis center. Miss Sinclair, the woman said warmly, we're calling to confirm your mother's outstanding balance has been paid in full. I froze beside the sink. There must be a mistake. No mistake. Every remaining balance has been cleared, including deposits for the next several months. My heart began racing. Who made the payment? A brief pause. The donor requested complete anonymity. Before I could process it, another call came less than an hour later. Noah sounded happier than I'd heard him in years. Maya, you're not going to believe this. The university just emailed me, someone set up a scholarship in my name. My tuition for the rest of the degree is already covered. I closed my eyes. Anonymous, again. There was only one person with both the resources and the discretion to make impossible problems disappear without expecting recognition. And yet, he hadn't called. He hadn't visited. He hadn't even sent flowers. By Monday, another surprise moved through Ashford Dynamics. An email from the executive office announced a full restructuring of workload policy. Mandatory overtime without executive approval was eliminated immediately. Unused reimbursement requests would now be processed automatically. Employee wellness reviews would move from annual to quarterly. Managers would be personally accountable for monitoring excessive workloads on their teams. Several supervisors quietly disappeared from the org chart before lunch. No public explanation was given. Rumors spread through every floor, a coming merger, a confidential audit, a board shakeup. Nobody connected any of it to the woman recovering quietly in a small apartment across the city. Except one person. Marcus visited me that afternoon, carrying a small gift bag from the office. Inside was my favorite herbal tea, a leather notebook, and a handwritten card with a single sentence, "Take the time your body has been asking for, no signature." It didn't need one. He hasn't stopped working on this since the day you collapsed, Marcus admitted before he left. I looked up, surprised. Working on what? He smiled gently. Making sure it never happens again. After he left, I sat by the window, watching rain gather along the fire escape. For the first time in years, I understood that someone had noticed the weight I'd been carrying long before I ever admitted it myself. And somehow, without asking for gratitude, Julian Ashford had begun changing an entire company because one exhausted assistant had finally run out of strength to hide her pain. 1 week later, I stood outside the glass entrance of Ashford Dynamics with a travel mug warming my hands and an unfamiliar feeling settling in my chest. For the first time since I'd been hired, I was nervous about walking into work. The revolving door reflected a woman who looked almost like me, except with more color in her face, and a hospital bracelet still circling her wrist beneath her sleeve. I took a slow breath before stepping inside. The lobby looked exactly the same, yet somehow completely different. The security guard smiled before I even reached the desk. "Welcome back, Miss Sinclair. Good to see you again." Co-workers greeted me with genuine warmth instead of their usual rushed nods. Someone had left fresh white lilies on my desk with a small card that simply read "Welcome back," no signature. I smiled despite myself. Before I could even organize my computer, my phone rang. "Mr. Ashford would like to see you." My heartbeat quickened. I walked toward his office, quietly rehearsing an apology for collapsing during the most important meeting of the year. When I knocked, his familiar voice answered, "Come in." Julian stood beside the windows overlooking the skyline, one hand in his pocket, morning light behind him. He turned as I entered, studying me carefully, not my clothes, not the folder in my hands. "Me. How are you feeling?" he asked. Such an ordinary question, yet hearing it from him caught me completely off guard. "Much better. Thank you." He was quiet a moment. "Sit down." I hesitated. In 3 years he had never once asked me to sit during a meeting. I obeyed anyway. Julian set a folder on the desk without opening it. "Your doctor sent his return-to-work recommendations." I blinked. "My doctor? With your permission, through HR." I nodded slowly, remembering the paperwork I'd signed at the hospital. Julian continued in the same calm voice he used in negotiations. "You'll work no more than 40 hours a week. You'll take lunch every day. You'll leave this building by 6 unless I personally approve otherwise." I almost laughed, certain he had to be joking. "Sir, I appreciate the concern, but there's too much work for that." "Then we'll hire more people." His answer came without hesitation. "The company will adapt." "You won't." I looked down at my hands, unsure how to respond. "You also have follow-ups every other Thursday afternoon." My eyes widened. "Those stay on your schedule. They're not optional." "I don't want special treatment." Julian stepped closer, expression composed. "Neither do I." He paused. "I want responsible treatment." Silence settled between us. Finally I gathered the courage to ask the question that had followed me all week. "Did you pay my mother's medical bills?" His eyes met mine, unreadable as always. "Your mother deserves proper care." "And Noah's tuition?" He looked toward the skyline. "He deserves the chance to finish what he started." My voice fell to almost a whisper. "Why?" Julian held my gaze for a long moment. "Because somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that carrying everyone else's burdens was your job." His expression softened just enough for me to notice. "Maya, it never was." I felt tears threaten for the first time since leaving the hospital, but I blinked them back before they could fall. He noticed anyway. Instead of saying another word, he picked up the day's schedule and quietly crossed out the last appointment. "Go home at 5 today." He glanced up. "The work will still be here tomorrow. I expect you to be, too." For the next several weeks, I slowly learned something that felt almost impossible: how to leave work while the sun was still in the sky. Every evening at exactly 5, a reminder appeared on my calendar that simply read, "Go home." I knew who'd placed it there, even without a name attached. The first 2 times, I ignored it. Both times, Julian appeared outside my office a few minutes later, jacket already over one arm. "You have somewhere else to be," he'd say, never angry, only calm and certain. Eventually I stopped arguing. My follow-up appointments became part of my routine. I started eating lunch away from my desk instead of pretending coffee counted as a meal. Noah called more often now, excited about classes instead of apologizing for tuition bills. My mother smiled more during dialysis because she no longer worried every treatment was another burden I carried alone. For the first time in years, life felt balanced. That was exactly when everything shifted again. It started with small things most people would have ignored. A black sedan parked across from the office 3 mornings in a row. An unfamiliar man near the coffee shop where I usually stopped, speaking quietly into an earpiece while pretending to read a newspaper. One afternoon I noticed a stranger watching the entrance before vanishing into the crowd the moment I looked his way. I told myself I was imagining it. The city was full of strangers. Not everyone was watching me. Then Marcus appeared beside my desk just before lunch. "Maya, do you have a minute?" His tone caught my attention immediately. He led me into a private conference room and closed the door. "Has anything unusual happened recently?" I hesitated. "I've noticed a few people around the building." He nodded slowly. "You were supposed to notice them." My confusion must have shown, because he continued. "Our security team has been monitoring individuals connected to one of Mr. Ashford's competitors. We believe they've started paying attention to people close to him." My stomach tightened. "People like me?" He didn't answer right away. "People they believe are important." I shook my head. "I'm only his assistant." Marcus offered a small, knowing smile. "That's what they used to think." Later that afternoon I found Julian standing alone by the windows after the final meeting ended. He didn't turn when I walked in, as if he already knew it was me. "Marcus spoke with you?" Not a question. "Yes." Silence lingered before I finally asked, "Am I creating problems for you?" Julian turned, expression unreadable. "You have never been a problem. But if someone's watching me because of my connection to you." "Maya." His voice stayed calm, but every word carried unusual weight. "You are not responsible for the choices other people make." I looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't want anyone getting hurt because of me," I said quietly. Julian stepped closer, only the desk between us now. "Nothing will happen to you." No dramatic promise, no raised voice, just a quiet confidence that somehow made me believe him completely. Still, as I walked toward the elevator that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that invisible eyes were following every step. And somewhere beyond the fading sunset, someone had begun treating the quiet assistant who never asked for help as the only weakness of the strongest man in the room. The next evening, the rain returned, soft at first, then steady enough to paint silver lines across the streets. I just finished a follow-up appointment and stepped out of the clinic carrying a small paper bag of medication. My phone buzzed almost immediately. A message from Julian: "Have Marcus drive you home." I smiled to myself. He'd become strangely predictable whenever my health was involved. I was still typing a reply when I realized I'd walked farther than I meant to. The parking garage beside the clinic was unusually quiet. I reached my car and noticed the black sedan again, the same one from outside the office, parked near the exit, headlights off. My heartbeat quickened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was exactly what Marcus had warned me about. I stepped back from my car and reached for my phone. Before I could dial Julian's number, another vehicle entered the garage from the opposite side. Marcus stepped out first, followed by 2 members of the security team. Relief hit me so fast my knees nearly gave out. Marcus walked over, calm as ever. "Mr. Ashford asked us to check on you when your appointment ended." I glanced toward the sedan. It pulled away without stopping. Marcus watched it go before looking back at me. "You trusted your instincts. That was the right call." 20 minutes later I sat in Julian's office instead of driving home. City lights shimmered beyond the windows while rain tapped the glass. Julian stood beside his desk, listening as Marcus explained what had happened. When the report ended, silence filled the room. Julian dismissed everyone with a single nod. The door closed behind us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally I broke the silence. I'm sorry. He looked at me, confused. For what? For bringing all of this into your life. Julian crossed the room slowly until only a few feet separated us. Maya. My name sounded different when he said it, softer than I'd ever heard. You still believe this is your fault? I lowered my eyes, because I did. He waited until I looked up again. Do you know what I found after you collapsed? I shook my head. I found that the strongest person in my company had convinced herself she had to survive every burden alone. His voice stayed calm, but every word reached somewhere deep inside me. You protected everyone around you while nobody protected you. A tear escaped before I could stop it. Julian noticed but let it be. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals, he continued quietly. I've solved problems people called impossible. And I completely failed to notice the person standing outside my office every single day. I should have seen you sooner, I whispered. I never wanted anyone to worry about me. He gave the smallest shake of his head. That was never your decision to make. His expression softened in a way I'd never seen before. Next time you're tired, tell me. Next time life gets too heavy, tell me. Next time you think you have to carry everything alone, he paused, holding my gaze with quiet certainty, ask me. The rain kept falling outside while neither of us moved. For the first time in years, I understood that accepting kindness wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the bravest thing a person could do. 6 months passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. The seasons turned outside the windows of Ashford Dynamics, carrying the city from gray winter mornings into bright spring afternoons, and somewhere along the way, life found a rhythm neither of us expected. I still arrived early, but never before the lights came on across the executive floor. I still worked hard, but I no longer measured my worth by the hours I stayed behind. Lunch became something I actually enjoyed instead of another meeting squeezed between emails. My doctor smiled at every appointment because my health kept improving. My mother laughed more often than she worried. Noah graduated near the top of his engineering class, and when he crossed the stage to receive his diploma, he searched the crowd until he found both of us sitting side by side. Julian didn't care that hundreds of people recognized him. That afternoon, he applauded louder than anyone. The company changed too. Employee turnover dropped to its lowest point in years. Wellness programs expanded. Managers learned that leadership meant paying attention before someone reached their breaking point. New hires assumed those policies had always existed. Only a handful of us knew they began with one exhausted assistant who quietly collapsed in a conference room. In public, Julian remained exactly who he'd always been, calm, disciplined, impossible to intimidate. Business magazines still called him one of the most influential executives in the country. Competitors still approached negotiations with careful respect. But the people closest to him noticed something different. Every evening before leaving the office, he walked past my desk without fail. Sometimes he asked if I'd eaten. Sometimes he reminded me about an appointment already written on both our calendars. Sometimes he simply glanced at the clock and said, "Time to go home, Maya." Eventually, I stopped pretending I had one more email to answer. One Friday evening, I finished organizing the last documents of the week and looked toward Julian's office. The lights were still on. I knocked gently and stepped inside. He was standing by the window as usual, watching the city settle beneath thousands of glowing lights. "You're still here," I said with a smile. He checked his watch and almost smiled back. "So are you." I laughed quietly. "I only stayed because I thought you might need these contracts before Monday." He took the folder, set it on his desk without opening it, then looked back at me. "I stayed because I wanted to make sure you didn't leave alone." For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the city's reflection shimmer across the glass. It struck me then that strength was never about carrying everything by yourself. Real strength was letting someone trustworthy stand beside you when life became heavier than expected. Julian had changed my future without asking for recognition. I had changed his priorities without ever intending to. As we walked toward the elevator together, the office lights switched off behind us, one row at a time, until only the skyline remained. I smiled, because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Some people save your life with extraordinary acts. Others save it simply by noticing that you've been pretending to be strong for far too long. And sometimes the quietest question anyone can ask becomes the one that changes everything. Are you really okay?